the Beltway has ever heard of it, and no one inside the Beltway really knows what it does, and we kind of like it that way. But the short answer is that we do just about everything. We are the central junction box of the executive branch of government. So most folks know us for our role in the budget process, and the way I explain this is that pretty much every dollar that flows from the Treasury out to the various agencies comes through our office. And most folks know us that. We write the president's budget. We sell the president's budget on the Hill. We take a lot of incoming flack for the president's budget from the media, et cetera. But beyond that, every single regulation, with certain exceptions, we talk about tonight, CFPB, for example, flow through our office. We write all the executive orders. We review all of the bills that have been passed by Congress to make recommendations to the president on whether or not they are vetoed or signed. If we want to draft a piece of legislation as an administration in order to go find a sponsor on the Hill, obviously we can't introduce legislation because that's not the way the Constitution set it up. But if we want to draft something up and go find a sponsor, we are the folks who draft it. We are the policy police for the president. And what we really do is we were created originally back in the 1920s to sort of help the president herd the cabinet. Because it used to be, you go back 100 years or so, the president would say, okay, you're now the Secretary of State. The guy said, thanks very much, and go off and do whatever he wanted to do. Now, he was always subject to being fired by the president, but there was really no way for the president to be involved in the management or the oversight of those particular agencies. So the Bureau of the Budget was created, and that changed the Office of Management and Budget in the 1970s to sort of just make sure that the agencies are doing what the president wants them to do. And our primary tool to do that is money. And that if you're doing what the president wants you to do at the Department of Interior, then the money flows relatively easily. If you're not, then we talk about, well, okay, let's figure out a way to get you on the same page as the president. So it's a fascinating place to be. It's the job I always wanted. When I first got to Congress, I was on the Budget Committee, and one of the very first witnesses was, at the time, the Director of Management and Budget. I'm like, wow, I remember that name from the 80s. David Stockman did this when I was a kid. I remember watching him when I was younger on TV. I'm like, that seems like a really cool job. And then when I found out what it really was, I'm like, that's what I'd like to do. And it took me a while, but I'm here. I'm having a great time doing it.
Well, congratulations. That's great. I come from the side of the government where we score revenues, right? I worked at the Joint Tax Committee, and then the Congressional Budget Office does kind of the baselines and scores the impact of spending, and Joint Committee scores revenue. So it's a much narrower purview, even if you stick them both together,
correct,
than your purview. But when it comes to tax reform, those two are going to be front and center. Joint Committee perhaps a little more so.
Yep.
How are you going to feel when you watch everyone on the court with the ball and you kind of have to watch them score? And
yeah.
What do you think you're going to think of their scores? How much pressure is going to be on those agencies right now as they score this most important agenda item?
Oh, tremendous pressure. Of course, there's always tremendous pressure, on especially the Congressional Budget Office. The Budget Act, it's actually the 1974 Budget and Impoundment Control Act, I think is the full name, gave a tremendous amount of responsibility, of power to the Congressional Budget Office, mostly through this thing that we call budget reconciliation. The reason you'll hear so much about the CBO scores, if you follow politics, and my guess is most folks in the room do, is because a part of that 1974 act that said certain things, if they fall into certain categories, are going to be so important, we're not going to allow the Senate to filibuster them. We're going to give them privileged treatment in the Senate, which means you don't have to have 60 votes to pass something. You only need 50. So if you can figure out a way to make something look like it fits into the square peg, or the square hole from the 1974 Budget Act, then you can pass it in the Senate with only 50 votes instead of 60 votes. Well, the gatekeeper to whether or not that square peg fits in that square hole is the Congressional Budget Office. And if they say, yes, this meets all the requirements, that it flows one way and gets 50 votes. If they say no, it flows another way and gets 60. I have no input into that at all. In fact, I've had some fairly high-profile fights with the CBO over how they count things, but they don't have to listen to me, and in fact, they don't listen to me. We don't have to listen to them, but again, they don't care. So no, it's frustrating to sit there and know that your numbers are different, and to see that what Joint Tax has done is different and CBO is different. You want to jump up and say, no, look at this. But you know, it's just that's politics.
It's part of the process.
Y'all had the same when OMB used to put out a score. I'm sure you'd look at it and say, that's just crazy. You guys don't know how to do it. Right?
But and it's interesting how there's all this specialists, and it brings a lot of viewpoints, I think, to the argument, which is really good. Now, when we talk about tax reform, tell us what your role was in the unified framework, and explain maybe a high-level summary of what's in the unified. It's called the Unified Framework for Fixing Our Broken Tax Code, and I agree with every word of that. So let's.
And it's about what, 4 pages, 5 pages, depending how big you want the.
Yeah, if you want to, if you take out the space, it's probably 4.
There's a group over in the executive branch, and it's called the Troika, and it's made up of the director of the Office of Management and Budget, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, and the secretary of the Treasury. And what that group is responsible for doing is sort of doing the long-term forecasts for our budget. As an administration, we think the economy will grow by X% next year. And then we work on also trying to figure out a way to craft policies to get us to that. When we started this administration, the CEA position was unfilled. So that was filled de facto by the head of the National Economic Council, Gary Cohn. So Gary Cohn and Secretary Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and I were the 3 members of the Troika. And what we did early in the year was said, okay, I'm going to focus on budget, and those 2 guys will take taxes. So they've really been driving the discussion on the Hill from the administration's perspective over taxes. So if I had to say it's Mnuchin 45%, Cohn 45%, and me 10. And what I end up doing now is selling it on television and to my former colleagues more than anything else. But the short, I don't know how to do a short version of what the taxes are, but essentially what it is, the 2 pillars from our perspective is we want the middle classes to pay less. Interesting conversation, by the way, to have in a class sometime of your own as to what middle class really is. I think you'd be surprised at how low it is. I think it stops at about $85,000. And it should be simpler for that group of people. That's one pillar. Why does simpler count? My guess is that every single one of your families pay somebody else to do their taxes. And I know that because roughly 90% of families, not businesses, 90% of families in this country pay someone else to do their taxes. And it just drives the president crazy. It says if you just have wage income, you shouldn't have to pay somebody else to pay your taxes. Go out and figure out a way to make it simpler. So that pay less and pay it simpler is one pillar, and the other pillar is this lower corporate tax. When we lowered corporate taxes to 235% back in the 1980s, we were at that time the lowest of any developed country in the world. Now that same 35% rate, which has not changed since the 1980s, is the highest in the developed world. Everybody else figured out how to beat us at our own game and undercut us. Even China has a lower rate. I think Russia has a lower rate. Ireland is talking about going from 8 or 11% to 8%. And there's all sorts of ramifications of that we might get a chance to talk about tonight. But those are 2 things that we really try to. We also want to get rid of the estate tax. There's certain ideas we have on expensing and so forth. But the 2 major pillars are that middle class component and the corporate tax component.
So I think your role, you say 10% in this troika that developed the unified framework. Your 10%, I think, is actually probably the most important. And the reason I think so as kind of a numbers person and a tax economist is that the arithmetic of tax reform, I believe, is the most difficult part of it. The arithmetic drives the politics, which kind of drives everything else. And the arithmetic is really difficult because lowering taxes is really expensive. And you want to be able to give a net tax cut that can be covered by dynamic scoring by growth. And that's, I think actually most people up there accept that. But it's hard to pay for things. The corporate rate costs about $1 trillion for every 10 percentage point reduction over 10 years. So I think the arithmetic is really hard, and your job is very, very important. Tell us a little bit about, I guess, how this arithmetic is going to work in dynamic scoring. Can you talk about dynamic scoring and what we expect to see? Do we think it's going to be easy to pay for? Right now, the Unified Framework allows for a $1.5 trillion tax reduction on a kind of a conventional scoring basis. And we'll cover that, hopefully, with some baseline issues and some dynamic scoring, right? But that's a lot of growth. How is this tax reform going to help it grow into that $1 trillion of tax revenues?
That's 15 really, really good questions in 30 seconds, so that's great. And by the way, we're budget people, and so one thing you need to realize is that when we talk numbers, we don't talk in years, we talk in decades.
That's right.
So when she says it costs $1.5 trillion or it raises up $500 billion, we always look in terms of what's called the 10-year budget window, which, by the way, is a complete fabrication. For a lot of administrations, it was 5 years, then it was 7 years, now it's 10 years. You could make it 20 if you want to, but just sort of the conventional not wisdom, but the conventional
Yeah,
dialogue
86,
is that
it
it's
was
10
5
years.
years.
It's
That's
10
right.
years. So it's 10 years when she uses numbers like that. Your question is, dynamic scoring is
Yes.
incredibly complex. You've got a $20 trillion economy, and if you want to change even just one dial on it a little bit, I want to raise one tax rate from 12% to 15%. Okay, and I want that to hit this group of people between this amount of money. The dynamic impact of that is tremendous and not impossible to measure, but really, really hard to measure accurately. A simple explanation of a dynamic model versus a static model is if you're selling hamburgers. I used to sell burritos. Okay, I owned a Mexican restaurant, and we had a couple stores. And in the way I'm selling a burrito for $5. And some people think the way to raise more money by selling burritos is to raise the price from $5 to $6. And other people think the way to raise more money from selling burritos is to lower the price from $5 to $4. Obviously see where this is going. The people say, well, if you raise it from 5 to 6, maybe you'll sell almost as many, and that 6 will generate more money. And other folks say, no, if you raise it from 5 to 6, you'll actually sell less, and you might raise less money. On the flip side, that if I can lower it from 5 to 4, I'll sell even more and make up that gap in volume, right? That is a simple explanation of a dynamic model, but you can start to sort of grasp how near impossible that is to do when you're talking about a $20 trillion economy. In fact, it's not impossible. The thing that's impossible to do is for somebody to agree on how to do it, because it just depends on how many assumptions you want to make on that filter through. So to get to your question about how is it going to impact growth, here's why we think the changes are going to impact growth. We think the biggest impact of our tax proposal on growth is actually that corporate tax. And here's why. How many econ majors have I got here? Okay, all right. A real simple function of economic growth, GDP, would include the size of the labor force times the productivity of that labor force. Okay, that's sort of national output, right? So there's really, if you boil it down in a simplistic way, it's a two-variable equation. You can either produce more in a single year, GDP goes up, by either having more people or having the same number of people or lower people be more productive, or a combination of both. Well, from a demographic standpoint, we're sort of at a lull. In fact, without immigration, the country is actually getting a little bit smaller every single year. So it's hard for us to drive a lot of GDP growth off of the workforce or the population size of that equation. So that immediately turns your attention to the other variable, which is productivity. And one of the things you learn about productivity is how much capital investment goes into economy helps drive the level of productivity. And one of the things we think we've seen in the last decade is that capital investment by domestic U.S. corporations has flatlined. In fact, we think it's probably gone down in certain very important segments. And we want to change that around. And what we're seeing, we think, is we're seeing domestic U.S. corporations either investing overseas or parking their money overseas and not investing it here. We think that we're doing that for tax reasons, because they can park money in Ireland at 8%, they bring it back here, they have to pay 35%. We try to change that and say if we lower the rate to 20%, it will give very profitable domestic corporations the incentive to invest here. That means capital investment, that means an increase in productivity, which means an increase in GDP. So that's what's driving it. That's the math of why we think this is going to happen. There's little pieces on the edges as well. You can talk about marginal rates and the impact that has on and pass-through rates with S corporations and LLCs. But the major driver, we think, is that corporate change from 35 to 20% to give the financial incentive to corporations who are already doing business here to take the money they're earning someplace else and moving it. I mean, they're just doing it. It's completely legal. Okay, they manipulate their earnings. It sounds like a terrible thing to do, but it's completely legal. And to actually get them to give them the incentive to leave the earnings here and be reinvested here to drive up that productivity.
So, because I think dynamics, and thank you for that. I think dynamic scoring is something we all read about in the paper, and it's never well defined. So that was very good. Now, I think so. In addition, we're going to have this tax bill.
Excuse me. And by the way, and that what I just explained, that's a dynamic model. Okay, yes. A static view of that would be we lower the tax from 35 to 20, and all we will do is raise less income or raise less government revenue by lowering the rate. That is a static view. That's that, raise the price of a hamburger and you'll make more money. That explanation I just gave about lowering a rate, which thus triggers corporate investment, which thus triggers productivity, which thus raises GDP, that is a dynamic model. I'm sorry.
No, that's exactly what we were trying to get at. Let me ask it. The distribution of this, so not only is growth, I think, going to be important in this bill, but the middle class tax cut, as you talked about, the middle class, it was a very populist election. This was a big deal. This was a kind of a new election. I guess, first of all, what surprised you about this election? Did anything surprise you?
Well, the answer that I'm supposed to give is that Trump won, but that's not the answer I'm going to give you for this reason. One of the really cool things about my job in Congress was that your colleagues, your coworkers, your best friends live all over the country, and they're heavily involved in politics. If you happen to like politics, it's actually a fun place to go work sometimes. Sometimes it's not. But anyway, on that election day, a buddy of mine, Scott Perry, called me. He's from Western Pennsylvania. Anybody here have Scott Perry as a member of Congress? General and one-star general? Okay. Nice guy, really good guy, good friend of mine. He calls me about 9 o'clock in the morning and said, I think Trump is going to win. And I said, why do you think that? He says, because I just voted out here in rural Pennsylvania in my box, and I was the 1,502nd person to vote. I said, okay, why do you think Trump is going to win? He says, because 4 years ago when I voted, at this time, I was the 402nd. And there was just huge, massive turnout in some of these areas. And what happened was that people who hadn't voted in a long time voted. So while a lot of people say that they were surprised by the outcome, I think a lot of us who were watching it very closely sort of had that indication early in the day that things were going to be different than they expected. What I think surprised me was the number of people who turned out who hadn't voted. By the way, that's one of the reasons that we're scared to death about polling now. And I'm going to take off my I'm sorry. Was that to you or to me?
That was for me.
Okay.
That's my secret signal that I cannot tell you.
I got you. All right. The polling scares. I take off my OMB hat, put my old congressional hat on. Polling scares us to death right now. In fact, Frank Luntz is a friend of mine. And he told me one time, he says, what really worries me is I think people are now afraid to tell pollsters the truth. And if they won't tell pollsters the truth, that means the data is completely worthless. He did the polling for Brexit and missed it quite badly. And face it, just about every poll in the nation, with I think the exception of maybe the Los Angeles Times, missed this last election very, very badly. So something has happened. Either people are not telling pollsters the truth, or pollsters are not asking the right people the right questions. And what surprised me was how wrong the pollsters were and how many people voted who hadn't been polled.
And the election, I guess, and I wasn't so much surprised by the result, but the populist nature has driven so much now, and that's why the distribution, the benefits, the way the benefits of this tax bill fall across different income classes is going to be a real arithmetic trick, right? Can you tell us about how? To me, it's like a Rubik's Cube. 20% of the people pay 80% of the taxes, or you have to kind of.
Oh, it's worse than that. I
think
it's
I think it might be 95
top
of income
20%
taxes, right?
of wage or of folks who file a tax return. Top 20% pay 95% of the taxes.
Of the income taxes. That's a huge.
If you break the income tax universe into what we call quintiles, so equal-sized 20% columns, the first two columns, the first quintile and the lower quintile, don't pay any taxes at all. In fact, they net positive. We pay them when they file a tax return. That middle quintile, which you might describe, some people do, as middle class, okay, pays an effective rate in the low single digits. And all of the taxes are paid by folks in the top 2 quintiles, and that last quintile pays almost fully 95%, I think, of the taxes. So it's really hard. People always ask at the time, why do you guys want to give a tax cut to the rich? Here's the math, okay? We have a progressive tax system, okay, which means that if you make $1 million and I make $50,000, okay, we both pay the exact same rate on the first, let's say, $20,000, okay? And then from the next 20 up to my 50, and her next 20 to her next 50, we pay the same. I think it's probably 12% or 15. I can't remember where the brackets are right now. And then she goes on to pay her higher rate on the stuff that she makes, and I stop, right? Well, if you want to give me in the middle class a cut, you take my 15% rate, say, down to 10%, right? And that gives the middle class a cut. Guess who else benefits from that? She does, because she pays that same rate on the way up the brackets. So it's almost like in order to handle it, to keep it almost identical, if you're just talking about changing the rates without changing the brackets, When you lower that middle class rate, you would, in fact, have to raise the rates on everybody above that in order not to change the distribution. It's extraordinarily complex and politically very, very difficult to sort of pull. You could sit there and do nothing but lower the rates on the middle class, and all other things being equal, you're going to give the rich a tax cut.
Yeah, and you're going to give more money, even a 20% rate cut for you and a 2% rate cut for me. I'll still probably get more dollars.
Sure, because you pay more of the tax.
And this is going to be, a political firestorm, I think. So I want to ask you, on the note of political firestorm, and because our time is waning.
Yes. Already? Goodness gracious. Okay.
I think so. We have everyone in this room, the Institute of Politics and Public Service at Georgetown, as we spoke on the way in, is one of 3 in the country. And it's a marvelous thing to have here in town. I think finally, people on the Hill can say, hey, I have experts right here across town. I don't have to call, Massachusetts. I don't have to call Chicago. Don't call them. And since I used to teach in this department, I feel that way too. But, so everyone is here because they believe in politics. It's not a dirty word for the Institute, and we try to promote public service, and these are some very enthused and super talented people. How do they get involved in what you're doing? Maybe not you personally, but how do we make opportunities for people like this? And what would you say, you in the Georgetown sweatshirt, I'm not pointing, you should do X tomorrow?
Okay. That's great. Not the first time I got that question, and I've given it a great deal of thought, and I think I have the right answer, at least for most folks. Go get a real job first. Seriously, the best thing, I never wanted to do this. I was one of the few people in the Foreign Service, my group that we hung out with, who didn't want to go into politics. Okay? I just didn't. I almost went to New York with my buddies from the college to go work on Wall Street just because I wanted to be in business. I was from a family of small businesses, and I went out, and I've worked at a law firm. I've started my own law firm. I started a home building business, I had a real estate business. This is the restaurant business. It was the best preparation I could ever do to then thereafter go into politics. And while this is a profession, and there are certain skills that you do need to learn to do it, I do worry about creating a class of people who are politicians and then a class of people who are businessmen and women. And you have to have cross-pollination between that. Otherwise, you don't understand the issues as well as you possibly can. I'll never forget, I was a freshman on the Budget Committee, and we were having a talk at that time, 7 years ago now, about corporate tax reductions. And I was the new guy, so I had to go last on my questions. I raised my hand. I said, when are we going to talk about individual taxes? And they said, well, that's too complicated. We're going to wait till after the next election. We're only going to deal with corporate taxes right now. And I said, hey, that's great. You know, of course, that like 82% of the corporations in this country don't pay the corporate tax. True. Okay? Most corporations in this country are small businesses, and they file as S-corps or LLCs, and they pay a pass-through rate, which actually they only pay the individual rate. So you can change all the corporate taxes you want, and you would never touch a single business that I ever worked for, and I worked for half a dozen of them. Okay? More than half of the people in the room had no idea what I was talking about. And it's not because they're stupid, it's just because their life experiences up to that point had not exposed them to that. If you've only ever been an employee, you have no idea what a K-1 is. If you've only ever worked in the military, you do not know what a pass-through rate is. If you've only ever been a teacher, you just don't know what that is because your life experience is having it. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means that you haven't been exposed to that. And the more things you can get exposed to in the real world before you come in and do this, I think has been of tremendous value. That's not to say you can't be successful and can't be extraordinarily successful. Paul Ryan, I think, has been in Washington, D.C. most of his life. He's one of the most capable, qualified, and bright people that I know. So there's certainly exceptions, but generally speaking, I think you'd be better served by going off into the real world, getting some experience, and then taking that and figuring out how to fix things from that perspective and coming into the political world to actually try and fix it.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Now, I think we're going to open it up to questions in the audience, and I'm going to ask you, since you're right in front of me, and then you in the green shirt next, please.
Thanks so much for coming. My name is Alec. I'm a sophomore in the college. I'm an econ major. I've been doing quite a bit of reading about the tax reform plan, and even among analyses I've read that use dynamic scoring, I can't find any that corroborate the OMB's numbers. So could you just talk a little bit about
which ones?
Particularly the Tax Policy Center and the CBPP?
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about the numbers that you're using and the math behind
Yeah.
making this revenue neutral.
I don't know what was the second organization you mentioned?
The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
That one I don't know. I don't know about the Tax Policy Center. Tax Policy Centers, and they admit this, it's a completely static model. So it's going to be apples to apples, and they did that, and they said that. And I think it immediately discredits the work. The head of the CEA actually gave a speech, is giving a speech, I think, today in Harvard, is going to speak exactly to that point. Plus, at this point, the framework did not lay out the brackets. You cannot do the math without the brackets. And it's not that we hid the brackets. They're not in a vault someplace in the White House. What it is that we said, okay, here are our principles. We recognize the fact that this is a political process. Take it, House Ways and Means Committee, take it, Senate Finance, and go for it and try and put details on it. And eventually they will. In fact, I think the House is proposing to put out its first set of details next week. But you can't score it without the numbers. I'll give you a perfect example. The one rate we know right now is the 0% rate, which we are proposing to go from $0 to $24,000. Our next rate above that is 12%. Okay? And we know it will start at $24,001. Now, whether or not that stops at $50,000 or $150,000 is a huge effing deal in the math. Okay? It just is. And you cannot score it without picking a number. And that's what the Tax Policy Center, they did their best guess of what the brackets might be, but their guess is no better than yours. Plus, when you combine that with a completely non-static model, again, you take the selling of a burrito and plug it in the tax policy model, and they say, last year you sold 100 burritos at $5. If you raise your price to $6 this year, you will raise $600. And I'm just telling you, that's not the real world, but that's the model that they use.
Yeah, I think they used the bracket cutoffs from the Camp Bill, which was out in February 2014, and says as their best guess. But as 9 pages doesn't describe the detail, certainly. So, any a green shirt, please.
Thank you, Director Mulvaney. My name is Darsh. I'm a first-year student in the MBA program here at Georgetown. My question is about the state and local tax deductions.
Yeah.
Right now it's looking like the House is going to have to vote on the budget resolution, and several members from New York and New Jersey say they will not vote for the budget resolution unless state and local tax deductions are preserved. What are your thoughts on that? And does the administration support that? Thank you.
Let me give you the 30-second explanation of what that is if you've never filed taxes. Let's say you make $100, but you paid $35 in taxes to your state and local governments last year. We allow you to deduct that from your income, so you take that 35 off the 100, right? Then you work from there. Here's my question to you, and I ask this purely. I mean, you could come up with whatever answer you want to this, but this is the way to ask the question. If you and I make the exact same amount of money, have the exact same lifestyle, live in the exact same house, and drive the exact same car, should we pay the exact same amount of federal tax? If the answer is yes, then you have to get rid of the state and local tax deduction. Because what happens right now is you and I make the exact, all other things being equal, she lives in New York and I live in South Carolina. She gets that $100, she makes $100, she gets to write off the $35 because that's what she pays to state and local taxes. I write off $10 because I live in a lower tax state. The federal government now taxes me at $90 and taxes her at $65. So she actually pays dramatically less in federal tax, all things being equal, than the folks in the low tax states. And that's what we're trying to get at. You talked before about distributions and so forth, and I think we didn't spend as much time on distribution as we did on fairness. I'm not really sure if people care about what other people pay in taxes as long as they feel like everybody's treated fairly.
I think you're probably right. I think people look at themselves and their own self, perhaps more than they do at the larger income distribution.
Am I getting, treated poorly, because I'm on TV and I won't try and use bad language. Am I being treated poorly and somebody else is being treated better than I am because they have a lobbyist or something like that? And I think that's one of the things we're trying to get rid of. So that's what I tell folks is that, and I tell that to Peter King. Now, Peter King is from a very affluent part of New York. New York City, I think, is in fact part of his district, and there'd be certain circumstances where that would be folks who actually might pay more taxes. It's not right, by the way, for the governor to come out and say that it's going to be, as I think Governor, who is it up there, Cuomo? Cuomo come out and said that it's going to be a tax increase on every New Yorker. Completely false. Okay? Most folks don't itemize their deductions in the first place. They take the standard deduction. And we're going to double the size of the standard deduction. And if you take the standard deduction, you didn't take the salt anyway, and you're not going to care. So we actually think that fewer people will itemize after we increase the size of the standard deduction. So actually fewer people will care about SALT afterwards than care about it now. So for a variety of reasons, we hope it stays in the bill, and we think it's good policy. We think it helps reestablish the credibility of the tax code and bring some fairness back to where it wasn't before.
I'm going to try to reach out that hand, and I can't see the face because you're in an aura.
Hello, I'm Joseph Majida. I'm a freshman in the college here at Georgetown.
Hey, Joseph.
President Trump recently put on Twitter that he will not cause any slashes to 401k retirement plans as a result of this tax plan. However, House and Senate leaders have stated there will be tax cuts to these plans, and President Trump was very shifty on the issue on Twitter today, on speaking with the press today, shifting from his stance from Twitter on this issue. So why is the administration so shifty about cutting 401k retirement plans? And can you give a definite answer today on whether these will be slashed as a result of the tax plan?
Yes, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't object to the term shifty, but I see your point entirely. That, keep in mind, go back to the original discussion about the pillars, all right, what the president is concerned about. Corporate taxes being reduced, and the middle class pays less, and it's simpler. And I think what you saw yesterday was him saying, look, if you start changing the 401k plans, which is the way that a large portion of the middle class save, then you're not going to accomplish that. If you take it down to what, I can't remember what the number floating around, I don't even remember where the number came from, essentially getting rid of the 401k tax, it's a huge tax increase on the middle class, and that would violate one of our two principles. So, again, this will go through the process. At the end of the process, we will look at the final product through that same prism that we did going into it, which is the corporate tax rate lower, and is the middle class lower and simpler? And if that's the case, then I think we'd support it. I can't imagine that the House and the Senate, controlled by the same party, would actually do something that would dramatically increase taxes on the middle class. But if they did, we would certainly give serious thought to vetoing that.
I think one thing to be, one of your jobs that's going to be interesting is to encourage people to kind of not look at every single provision, but to look at the bottom line, look at the net impact. That's very, very difficult. I mean, I've, been in the Finance Committee and the Leader's Office, but also, I've been a lobbyist. And it's hard, people, like, they drill down on the 401k, which is totally legitimate, on the SALT deduction, which is totally legitimate. But how are you going to help people kind of understand, look at the bottom line, stay with us until it's finished?
Raise your hand if you think you were alive the last time we did major tax reform in this country.
Oh, I was.
Okay, that's it. Look around, okay? You probably were, judging by the hairline. Yes, I get it. 1986. 1986 was the last time we did this because it's really, really, really hard. By the way, yeah, this hurts coming from me, doesn't it? It's really hard to do, just because of what Kathy mentioned, is that you can always drill in and go, like Governor Cuomo did, oh, there's something I don't like, that's bad for my people, so we should all be against this, as opposed to looking at it as a whole package and say, okay, what's the impact on everybody when we do it like this? Specific examples, okay? Go back to that idea about, let's say, for example, that you came up with a tax plan that was really, really simple to do, but it didn't change your taxes at all. All it did was allow you to file your own taxes instead of paying somebody else to do it. Do you really care if your taxes go down by $200 or you save $200 worth of tax prep costs? It's all money to you, right? So there's a way to look at it holistically. Also, we'd look at, and we just put out a paper, in fact, the reason that Kevin Hassett is up at Harvard tonight talking about this is that CEA put out a study that said there used to be a strong correlation between corporate earnings and household earnings in this country. And for the 70 years leading up to 2008, every time corporate profits went up by 1%, household incomes went up by 1%. Yet something happened in the last recession, and since 2008, corporate profits up about 11%, household earnings up 0.3%, all right? We think that part of that is, in fact, a large part of it, is this part about parking money overseas. Apple makes money, they park the money in Ireland, which they do. It benefits the shareholders and the CEO because they get paid on the profitability of the whole enterprise. But it doesn't benefit the people working here because Apple is not investing in their productivity. Their productivity doesn't go up. They can't get the wage gains that we'd like to see, right? So one of the things that we've talked about, and we've got math to back this up, it'd be fascinating. You should have Kevin Hassett come out and talk about this sometime. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. And he said, look, the tax plan we think will translate to at least $4,000 worth of additional average U.S. household income. That's annual, by the way. So there's that idea of instead of looking at bits and pieces, you don't look at the corporate tax rate and what it does immediately to revenues. You simply say, okay, look at that, and if it really does have that impact, aren't you better off? There's a great ad running, by the way. I listened to WTOP as I walked to work in the morning, and somebody's running an ad that is nothing more than a speech President Kennedy gave back in the 1960s about the importance of reforming the taxes and lowering the rate, and that's where the famous line comes that a rising tide raises all ships. But that's sort of how we encourage people to look at tax reform. You cannot look at the individual, granular thing. You have to sort of look at it as a package.
I think you're going to be busy doing that from now until it's signed.
That's right.
Right? We have another question? Oh, I was looking at this blue-shirted person here, and then I'll get over there. I'm not sure what our time is left. You have a very tight, you have a tight stop,
yeah,
right?
I'm taking my daughter to dinner, which is very
important.
Which
is very important.
So Director Mulvaney, thank you for coming to talk to us. My name is Alan. I'm a senior in the college. My question hopefully is pretty simple.
I hope so too.
As Republicans, how is the current administration justifying the deficit increasing nature of its tax plan? And is this consistent with your previous statements on the nature of deficit neutrality?
Thank you. Listen, I got asked the other day what keeps me up at night, and it's the same thing it did when I first got here, which is the deficit. It's deficit. The debt, really, as much as the deficit. The debt is nothing more than the accumulated deficit. Every year you have a deficit, it gets added and becomes the debt, right? And from a budgeteer's standpoint, which is what we do, we sit there and we go, oh my goodness gracious, you have effectively $20 trillion. It's not really that number in terms of what's sort of exposed to interest rates because about $4 trillion of it is internally held. But let's say for sake of discussion, it's $20 trillion. Every 1% interest, 1% increase in the carry cost, which is what interest is $200 billion, okay, which is just a huge sum of money. In fact, this year, interest will be bigger than any discretionary spending program except defense. And that's an effective rate of, I think, 2.25% or something like that. So it's outrageously cheap money right now. And I worry about the exposure to the debt long-term to the nation. When I got here to Washington, I used to think, well, what we have is a revenue problem, not a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. We could solve this through spending. Mathematically, that's true, by the way. Mathematically, you could simply decide that you're only going to spend what you take in, okay, and you would balance the budget. You could actually go to surplus by reducing your spending. It's just math, right? You get spending low enough. All I'm telling you is you wouldn't accept that. I don't care if you're a Republican, I don't care if you're a Democrat. We've trained America to expect more government than they're willing to pay for. All right? You will not accept. We have a deficit this year of $666 billion, okay, out of a total budget of roughly $4 trillion. No one would accept a $666 billion reduction in our expenditures to balance the budget last year. So what I'm able to do on the spending side of the ledger is limited. Right? Still going to do it, still going to push as hard as I can. We sent $54 billion worth of reductions up to the Hill this year. But the other variable is where I have to look. And the other variable in that deficit equation is the revenues. So how do I figure out a way to grow the revenues? My two choices, I can't leave it status quo, right? Because then I know where my numbers are. I either raise taxes and hope I raise more money like that, or being a good Republican, I lower taxes and hope I get the growth to raise more revenues that way. And I actually do believe that the tax reform policy combined with things like our regulatory policy, which is already kicking in. By the way, if you're 30 years old, everybody here is 30. Y'all have never had a job in a healthy American economy. We've had a substandard American economy now for the last 8.5, 9 years. You have no idea what it's like to live in a thriving American economy. And I want you to know, it's absolutely fabulous. One of the reasons I was able to start all those businesses I mentioned was that during the 90s and then again in the early part of the 2000s, we had a healthy American economy. We had growth rates on average above 3%. And the things you can do with that are so dramatically different and better than you can do at 1.8%. every time I do this, I don't tell him this story. I was talking to Trey Gowdy, who's my best friend in Congress, great lawyer, terrible mathematician. I was telling him one day about the difference between 2% annual growth and 3% annual growth, and he looks at me and says, what difference does it make? It's only 1%. I'm like, no, it's not. It's 50% difference. Jesus. Anyway, so the things that we can do at 3% growth are fabulous. And yeah, do the rich get richer? Absolutely. So does the middle class, and so does the poor, which is the model that we've used to build the nation for the last 200 years. We've got this tremendous wealth-creating machine in this country, and it has created wealth for a long time for everybody. The last 10 years, it's really broken down, okay? Which is why you see the rise in inequality. You see that the wealth gains are not shared across all groups. We're trying to fix that, and we think if we do, not only will everybody get richer, the government will get richer because y'all will pay more in taxes. And that's what I need to try and get at that deficit and that debt.
Well, we have time for one more question, and I really don't know how to and she chose. Yep, go ahead, choose.
Then I want to tell my story at the end of my story.
Okay, yes, we have one important story.
It's a good story.
It is a great story.
I'm Hans Sheldon from the college. I had a question. There have been murmurings, so potentially inserting a fourth bracket that stays at 39.6.
Yeah.
And only comes into play with, I think it's individuals over $1 million or something like that.
I've heard the same thing, yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
We are agnostic about it. We believe, actually, that's a fifth rate to us. We believe we've offered a four rate, which is 0, 12, 25, and 35. And I think the president gave as good an answer he gave the other day, which is, how do you feel about it? He said, look, corporate tax reduction and middle class reforms and reductions, right? If in order to get what I want over here, the House or the Senate has to put a 39.6 rate in, that's not going to kill the deal for us. But we are not pushing it. We're not pushing against it. We've left that to the House as part of this process, this sausage-making process of making law. So
right now, taxpayers who earn over like 418 and 470 already pay that. So it seems like a painless way to make ends meet if you have to.
Again, I don't know the math, but again, because it's not part of our proposal, we'll leave it to the House and the Senate to come up with their own numbers.
So tell me about appearing on a talk show, please.
We were talking out in the hallway because we have our Parents' Weekend this weekend, and a friend of mine asked me if I had watched, apparently, what's his name, skewered me, John Oliver, on last night. This week, last night, which I love. I watch the show all the time, but I missed it. So I had to go back and watch the episode. And I was thinking to myself, boy, wouldn't it be great to go on the show? But of course, there's a rule that we can't go on those shows. And there's a reason that no politicians go on these comedy shows anymore. And it's because a guy about 10 years ago went on. It was at the time. I think it was the Colbert. It was Jon Stewart. And about, do you know your district? It was a member of Congress who went on, do you know your district? And they asked him a question about why your district is famous. He says, my district is famous because we used to put 10 commandments on the wall of the courthouse. And they asked him, Congressman, that's great, you really do know your district. Can you name the 10 commandments? And he couldn't do it. In fact, 3 out of 10 is really good in baseball, not really good in how many 10 commandments you can make. So I was telling that story to a more senior member of Congress when we were playing golf one afternoon in a charity event. And because I said I got invited to go on the show, and I said, but they told me not to go on the show. And the guy goes, I was the only guy to go on the show after that guy got on and got ridiculed about the 10 Commandments. And I said, well, I thought nobody else went on. And he goes, because the show didn't run. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, a young woman working for me was an assistant producer. Her boyfriend was an assistant producer, and they couldn't get anybody to go on the show after they embarrassed that poor guy on the 10 Commandments. And she begged me, and she begged me, and begged me. And I told her, I said, look, if I win my next election by more than 20, 25 points, I'll go on the show. And he did, okay? And he doesn't mind me telling, it's John Yarmouth from Kentucky. And John went on the show. And, of course, they do all the, blah, 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 do you know this about your district? And they said, Congressman, you're from Louisville, Kentucky. It strikes us you should know a little bit about bourbon. And he said, well, yes, I think I probably should. They said, would you like to take a taste test? And he said, sure. They said they brought 2 glasses out, and he said that he made a big show of it. He took it, and he took a sniff of it, and then asked for something to cleanse his palate, and took another, and sat back in the chair after making this big production and said, well, John, unless I miss my guess, that is Kentucky bourbon, and that is Tennessee sipping whiskey. And the guy says, oh, that's absolutely fantastic. You're absolutely right. Thanks so much for coming on the show. And he goes, oh, wait a second. My producer's in my ear telling me that you had a 50-50 chance. Would you like to take the test again? And before he could say anything, they put 2 more glasses down in front of him. Okay? And he looked at it like this. Okay? They're on a tray. And he didn't touch them, didn't smell them. He looks at it and said, now, John, I don't get this. I thought we were friends. I mean, I took your little test. I came on your show. No one will go on your show after you did what you did to that guy a couple years ago, and I did this as a favor to you, and I took your little test, and I passed it. And now you come out here and try and trick me by putting out 2 glasses of Jack Daniels. And he was absolutely right.
Really?
He knew what it was by looking at it, didn't even have to taste it, didn't even have to smell it. And I said, why didn't it run? He said, it didn't run because it didn't make me look bad. So that's why we don't go on the show, because if we go on the shows and we do something that makes us look good or make the host look bad, it never, ever runs. We go on the show and we look like idiots, then they run it. So anyway, that's one of my favorite congressional stories. Anyway, is that okay? See that? Thank you very much. My press secretary's here, and she's over there having a heart attack that I would tell something, and I didn't pretty clear with them. Anyway, thank you very much for having me. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.